The vial was no larger than a child's thumb. It sat in the widow's palm, catching the amber light of a single candle. Outside, the streets of Palermo murmured with the footsteps of merchants and monks, the rattle of carts over cobblestone, the distant toll of vespers. Inside, the room smelled of rosewater and something else, something faint, metallic, like the air before a storm. The woman who handed it over did not smile. She did not need to. Her eyes, dark as church shadows, held a quiet understanding that required no words. The widow's fingers closed around the glass, warm, smooth, unremarkable. 4 drops, the woman whispered, in wine or broth. He will not taste it. The widow nodded. Her husband had struck her that morning. Again. His knuckles had left a bloom of purple along her jaw. The priest said suffering was holy. The law said she was his property, but this small thing in her hand, this was hers. She left through the back door, her cloak pulled tight against the autumn wind. Somewhere in the tangled alleys of the old quarter a bell rang once, twice, and in the silence that followed, history held its breath. The year was 1633, and in the shadow of the Inquisition, a different kind of justice had begun to flow. Chapter 1. The Widow's Trade. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now. The world has grown small and still. Wherever you're listening, whether beneath warm blankets or in the glow of a single lamp, I hope you're comfortable. I hope you're safe. The stories we tell here are old ones, true ones, drawn from the darker corners of history where candlelight flickered against stone and the past kept its secrets close. Before we begin, if you have not yet subscribed, I invite you to do so. These tales take time to unearth, to shape, to whisper into being. Your support allows them to continue. Now, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And what hour has found you? Is it late where you are? Or perhaps early in that strange blue time before dawn, when the world feels like it belongs to ghosts? Wherever you are, whatever the hour, let us drift backward together, back through centuries, back to a time when justice wore a different face, when suffering was woven into the fabric of daily life, and when women, those with nowhere left to turn, found their own silent remedies in the shadowed corners of Italian cities. Let us begin in Palermo. The year is 1633. The streets of Palermo in the early 17th century were a labyrinth of narrow alleys and crumbling archways, where sunlight rarely touched the ground, and the air hung thick with the smell of salt, rotting fish and incense from the churches that rose like fortresses above the tenements. It was a city of contrasts, Spanish governors in their gilded palaces, monks in threadbare robes, merchants hawking silk and spices from the east, and beneath it all the poor, packed into warrens of stone where entire families lived in single rooms and disease moved faster than prayer. The widows were everywhere. Some wore black from head to toe, their faces hidden behind veils as they shuffled through the markets or knelt in the churches, clutching rosaries worn smooth by desperate hands. Others were younger, their mourning clothes still crisp, their eyes not yet emptied by grief. They came from all stations, the wives of sailors lost at sea, of soldiers dead in foreign wars, of men who had simply disappeared into the chaos of plague or poverty or violence. But there were other widows too, widows whose husbands had not died of fever or blade or accident, widows whose mourning was quieter, whose grief did not reach their eyes, widows who had learned somewhere in the dark that deliverance did not always come from God. In the quarter near the old Norman cathedral, there was a woman who sold cosmetics. Her shop was small, wedged between a cobbler and a seller of religious icons. The sign above the door bore no name, only a painted image of a glass vial wrapped in ivy. Inside, the air was different, cooler, tinged with the scent of rosewater and almond oil and something else, something faintly acrid that lingered at the back of the throat. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with ceramic jars and glass bottles of varying sizes, powders for the complexion, oils for the hair, tinctures for headaches, for sleeplessness, for the pains that came with childbirth and age. Women came and went throughout the day, their transactions conducted in low voices, their purchases wrapped in cloth and tucked into baskets or beneath shawls. Most of them bought exactly what they said they were buying, but not all. There was a language to the trade, unspoken but understood, A woman who asked for something to help with a difficult situation might receive a salve for bruises. A woman who asked twice, her voice lower the second time, might be invited into the back room. There, behind a curtain of faded velvet, the transactions became quieter still. The woman who ran the shop was not young, but neither was she old. Her face was difficult to remember, pleasant enough, unremarkable, the kind of face that vanished into a crowd. Her hands were steady, her voice was soft. She never asked questions that did not need asking. She knew what the women needed before they found the words. Marriage in 17th century Italy was not a partnership. It was a transfer of property, of the woman herself, from father to husband, bound by law, blessed by the church, enforced by custom and violence. A wife had no legal identity separate from her husband. She could not own property. She could not testify in court. She could not leave. If her husband beat her, the law did not intervene. The church told her to endure. Her family, if they knew, might counsel patience, prayer, submission. If she fled, she had nowhere to go. Convents required dowries she did not have. The streets were more dangerous than her home, and if she returned, the beating would be worse. If her husband drank himself into rages, gambled away her dowry, took mistresses, brought disease into their bed, there was no recourse. Divorce did not exist. Annulment was a tool of the wealthy and well-connected, not the baker's wife or the widow of a minor merchant. And if her husband killed her, as many did, in fits of drunken fury or cold calculation, the punishment, if any came at all, was a fine, a payment, a public penance. Rarely imprisonment, almost never execution. The law valued a man's authority over a woman's life, but there were other laws, older ones. Quieter ones. The widows who came to the shop near the cathedral were not monsters. They were not mad. They were women whose bodies bore the evidence of years, scars along the ribs, broken fingers healed crooked, teeth missing from blows to the jaw. They were women who had lost children because a husband's rage had induced miscarriage. Women who watched their daughters grow and feared what awaited them. They came because they had tried everything else. They had prayed. They had confessed. They had asked their priests for guidance and been told that suffering was holy, that obedience was virtue, that martyrdom awaited the faithful. They had asked their families for help and been told to keep the peace, to think of their children, to remember their duty. They had swallowed their humiliation and their pain, and hoped that time or age or God would soften the men who hurt them. And when none of that worked, they came to the shop. The transaction was always the same. The woman behind the counter would listen. She would nod. She would disappear into the back room and return with something small, a vial of clear liquid, a packet of powder, a tiny bottle stoppered with wax. She would explain, in a voice barely above a whisper, how it was to be used, how much, how often, how long it would take. She would never say what it was. She would never say what it would do, but the women understood. The symptoms began slowly. A husband might complain of stomach pains. Mild at first. Nothing that could not be attributed to bad wine or spoiled meat. His wife would tend to him dutifully, bringing him broth, water, bread. The pains would ease, he would recover, and then, a week later, they would return. This time, worse, vomiting, diarrhea. A weakness in the limbs that made it difficult to rise from bed. His skin would grow pale, clammy. His hands would tremble. Physicians, if they were called, would diagnose an imbalance of humours, a corruption of the blood, a fever without heat. They would prescribe purges, bloodletting, herbal remedies that did nothing. The husband would linger for weeks, sometimes months. Long enough for debts to be paid, for property to be secured, for wills to be written. Long enough that when death finally came, it seemed like mercy. And the widow would mourn. She would wear black. She would attend the funeral. She would weep, sometimes genuinely, not for the man, but for the girl she had been when she married him, for the life she might have lived if the world had been different. And then she would return to her home, a free woman under the law, entitled to whatever her husband had left behind. No one suspected. Why would they? Men died all the time. They died of plague, of fever, of consumption, of apoplexy, of injuries sustained in brawls or accidents. They died in their sleep, or choking on their own vomit, or wasting away over weeks while their families prayed and physicians shook their heads. Death was common, death was ordinary, and women, quiet, pious, obedient women, were the last people anyone would suspect of bringing it about. The network grew slowly, carefully, over years. A widow would tell a sister would tell a cousin would whisper to a neighbour whose bruises were too fresh to hide, and one by one, women found their way to the shop near the cathedral, or to others like it in Rome, in Naples, in the smaller towns scattered across Sicily and the mainland. They did not speak of it openly. They did not gather in groups. There were no meetings, no manifestos, no declarations. This was not rebellion in any recognised form. It was survival, conducted in silence, protected by the same invisibility that had always shielded women's work, the cooking, the cleaning, the care of the sick and dying. No one watched what a wife put in her husband's soup. No one questioned a widow's tears. And so the poison moved through Italy like a shadow, unseen, unspoken, leaving behind a trail of men who died unremarkable deaths, and women who inherited their freedom one quiet grave at a time. The church preached forgiveness, the law preached obedience. But in the hidden corners of the old cities, another doctrine was being written, passed from hand to hand in vials no larger than a child's thumb, and at the centre of it all, in Palermo, in Rome, in the narrow rooms where candles burned low and women whispered their desperation, there was a name. Giulia Tofana. Chapter 2. Aqua Tofana. The poison had a name, though it was rarely spoken aloud. Aqua Tofana. Water of Tofana. Sometimes called Acqua di Napoli in the southern provinces, or Manna di San Nicola in the markets of Rome, where it was sold in bottles bearing the image of a saint as though blessed by the very hands of God. The name changed depending on where it was sold, who was selling it, and who might be listening. But the substance itself remained constant, a clear, colourless liquid that tasted of nothing, smelled of nothing, and killed with a patience that mimicked the hand of fate itself. It was not a single ingredient. It was a formula, a recipe passed down through generations of women who had learned the language of plants and minerals, who had studied the old texts on alchemy and medicine, who had discovered through trial and bitter error which substances could end a life without leaving a trace that even the most learned physician could identify. The base was arsenic trioxide to be precise, white arsenic, as it was known in the apothecaries and markets where it could be purchased openly, legally for the declared purpose of killing rats. It came in crystalline form, ground into a fine powder that dissolved easily in water or wine, tasteless, odourless, invisible, a gift from the earth itself, mined from the mountains of Saxony and Bohemia, imported into Italy by merchants who thought nothing of selling death by the pound, to housewives who claimed to have problems with vermin. And they did have problems with vermin, just not always the kind that scurried through grain stores. But arsenic alone was too recognisable. Physicians had begun, by the early 17th century, to understand its effects. The violent gastrointestinal distress, the burning sensation in the throat and stomach, the characteristic garlicky odour that sometimes appeared in the breath or sweat of the poisoned. A sudden death from arsenic poisoning might raise questions. An autopsy, crude as the science was in that era, might reveal inflammation of the stomach lining, unusual discoloration of the organs, so the formula was more sophisticated. To the arsenic lead acetate was added, sugar of lead, a compound that had been used since Roman times as a sweetener, despite its toxicity. It had a faintly sweet taste that masked bitterness, and it brought its own quiet devastation. Damage to the kidneys, the nervous system, the blood itself. A man dosed with lead over time became weak, confused, prone to seizures and tremors. His mind might cloud, his hands might shake, he might be dismissed as drunk or mad, or simply worn down by age and labour, and finally belladonna, deadly nightshade. A plant that grew wild in the Italian countryside, its dark berries beautiful and lethal. The juice extracted from its leaves and roots contained atropine and scopolamine, alkaloids that caused delirium, blurred vision, rapid heartbeat, paralysis of the smooth muscles. In small doses, it had been used for centuries by physicians to treat pain, to dilate the pupils, to induce sleep. In larger doses, it killed. But in the formula of Aqua Tofana, belladonna was not the primary killer. It was the mask. It created symptoms that confused diagnosis, that made the victim's death seem like a fever, a fit, a sudden apoplexy. It blurred the line between poison and disease, between murder and the hand of God. The preparation of Aqua Tofana was a craft that required patience, precision, and knowledge that could not be written down. It was not enough to simply mix the ingredients together. The proportions had to be exact. Too much arsenic, and the death would be too swift, too obvious. Too little, and the victim might recover and suspicion would take root. The lead had to be dissolved properly, heated and cooled in a process that required steady hands and an understanding of temperature and solubility. The belladonna had to be extracted at the right time of year, when the plant's alkaloid content was highest, and strained through cloth until only the purest essence remained. The final product was diluted with distilled water. Clean water, boiled and cooled, free of impurities that might cloud the liquid or alter its properties. The result was a solution so clear it could pass for holy water, so mild it could be mistaken for a tonic, so deadly that 4 drops could kill a man if administered steadily over the course of weeks. 4 drops in his wine at dinner, 4 more the next evening. A careful, measured dosing that allowed the poison to accumulate in the body, to settle into the tissues, to begin its slow work of destruction. The victim would not die immediately. He would sicken gradually, in a way that seemed natural, inevitable. His appetite would fade, his strength would ebb, he would take to his bed, and his wife would care for him dutifully, bringing him water, broth, bread soaked in wine, and in that wine 4 more drops. The women who made Aqua Tofana were not witches, though they would later be called such. They were apothecaries, midwives, herbalists, women who had always occupied the liminal space between life and death, who had always been the ones to usher children into the world and to ease the suffering of the dying. They knew plants, they knew the body, they knew how much poppy to give a woman in labour, how much willow bark to reduce a fever, how much hemlock to ease the pain of a man dying of cancer. And they knew how much arsenic would kill without raising suspicion. This knowledge was not written in books. It could not be. The Church had long ago declared that women who practiced medicine without the sanction of male physicians were suspect, that their remedies bordered on witchcraft, that their very knowledge was a form of disobedience against the natural order. The Inquisition had burned women for less, for healing too well, for knowing too much, for possessing the kind of power that should have belonged to men or to God alone. So the knowledge was passed in whispers, from mother to daughter, from midwife to apprentice, in the kitchens where women prepared meals and medicines side by side, where the line between nourishment and poison was thinner than anyone cared to admit. A woman learned which mushrooms were safe and which brought convulsions. She learned which berries could ease pain and which stopped the heart. She learned that the same plant that healed in small doses killed in large ones, that the difference between remedy and poison was often just a matter of quantity and intent. And some women, those who had seen too much suffering, who had held too many broken bodies, who had watched too many women die in childbirth or at the hands of violent husbands, some women learned to use that knowledge not to heal, but to deliver a different kind of mercy. The beauty of Aqua Tofana was its invisibility. It left no smell. It left no taste. When mixed into wine or broth or even water, it vanished completely, indistinguishable from the liquid that carried it. A wife could dose her husband's evening meal without him ever knowing. A daughter could add it to her father's wine. A servant could slip it into the master's cup. And the symptoms, when they came, were so common, so ordinary, that they attracted no suspicion. Stomach pain? Everyone had stomach pain. The food in 17th century Italy was often spoiled, poorly preserved, contaminated. Bread made with mouldy grain, meat gone rancid in the heat, wine that had turned to vinegar. A man complaining of cramps and nausea was not unusual. It was Tuesday. Weakness? Trembling? Men grew weak. They aged. They drank too much. They worked too hard. A merchant who could no longer lift a bolt of cloth, a labourer who stumbled on the job, these were signs of a life lived hard, not signs of poison. Even the more dramatic symptoms, the delirium, the rapid heartbeat, the dilated pupils, could be explained away. Fever, apoplexy, a stroke, the humours out of balance, an excess of black bile. The explanations were endless, and none of them pointed to murder. And by the time the victim died, weeks or even months after the first dose, the connection between his death and anything his wife might have done was impossible to trace. There were no autopsies in most cases. The body was washed, wrapped, buried or burned according to custom. The widow mourned, the family grieved, the priest prayed for the dead man's soul, and life went on. But Aqua Tofana was not only used for murder. Some women used it simply to make their husbands more manageable. A single dose, carefully administered, could induce enough nausea and weakness to keep a violent man in bed for a few days. Too sick to raise his fists, it was a warning, a reminder of mortality, a way of saying without words, I could end this, I could end you, but I'm showing mercy. Some men, it was said, became better husbands after a brush with the poison. They grew cautious, they softened. They remembered, perhaps, that the woman who cooked their meals and poured their wine held their lives in her hands 3 times a day. Others did not learn, and for them the doses continued. The poison could be stretched across months, the victim growing weaker and weaker until death came like a long exhalation, a slow fade into the darkness. Or it could be condensed, increased, hurried along if circumstances demanded it, if a wife needed to remarry quickly, if debts were mounting, if there was another man waiting, if the risk of discovery was growing too great. The formula was flexible, the poison was patient, and the women who used it learned to read the rhythms of life and death with the precision of musicians playing a familiar score. Yes, the Church, of course, knew nothing of this, or if it knew, it did not speak. The confessional booth heard many sins, but this particular sin, this quiet, domestic act of rebellion, was either never confessed or never reported. Perhaps the priests themselves understood, on some unspoken level, that to expose the trade would be to expose the conditions that made it necessary. To ask why so many wives were poisoning their husbands would be to ask why so many husbands were worth poisoning, and that was a question the Church was not prepared to answer. So the poison moved through Italy like a secret river, invisible, unstoppable, fed by the tears and rage and desperation of women who had been told all their lives that suffering was their lot, that obedience was their virtue, that there was no escape except through death. And when death would not come for their tormentors, the women learned to bring it themselves, in a vial, clear as water, deadly as prayer. Chapter 3. Giulia Tofana. There are lives that history remembers in full, birth records, baptismal certificates, letters written in careful script, portraits painted in oil and hung in galleries for centuries, and then there are lives that exist only in fragments, glimpsed through trial records and accusations, through the testimonies of enemies and the silence of those who loved them. Giulia Tofana was the latter. She was born, most likely in Palermo, sometime in the last decades of the 16th century. The exact year is lost. Her father's name is unknown. Her childhood is a blank space in the historical record, a void that has been filled over the centuries with speculation, rumour and myth. What is known? What can be traced through the fractured documents that survived the fires and floods and deliberate erasures of the Inquisition is that she was the daughter of Tofania d'Adamo, a woman who was executed in Palermo in 1633 for the crime of poisoning her husband. The execution was public, as all executions were. It took place in the Piazza Marina, a wide square near the waterfront where the gallows stood permanent, where the crowds gathered for spectacle and judgment, where the church and state demonstrated their authority over life and death. Tofania d'Adamo was strangled first, a mercy reserved for women, and then her body was burned. The ashes were scattered. No grave, no marker, no place for her daughter to mourn. Giulia would have been in her 30s then, old enough to have learned her mother's trade, old enough to understand what the execution meant, not just the loss of a parent, but a warning, a message written in smoke and bone. This is what happens to women who defy the order of things. But Giulia did not stop. If anything, she expanded. By the time her mother's ashes had cooled, Giulia Tofana had already left Palermo. She moved north, to Rome, the eternal city, the heart of Christendom, where the Pope held court and the Inquisition maintained its headquarters, and the streets were crowded with pilgrims, priests, merchants, beggars, artists, and thieves. It was a city of layers, marble churches built atop pagan temples, Renaissance palaces rising from medieval ruins, a place where the sacred and the profane existed side by side, where miracles were reported daily and murders went unsolved for years. It was the perfect place to disappear, and the perfect place to work. Giulia established herself quietly, without fanfare. She did not open a shop with a sign above the door. She did not advertise her services. She did not need to. The women found her, as they had found her mother, through the invisible networks that existed beneath the surface of public life. The networks of laundresses and midwives, of servants and market vendors, of women who spoke to each other in low voices while their hands were busy with work, who passed information in whispers and glances and coded phrases that men never heard. She lived modestly, in a small house near the Tiber, in a neighbourhood where no one asked too many questions. She dressed plainly, like a widow or a woman of modest means. She attended Mass regularly, confessed her sins, or some version of them, and made donations to the local parish. She was unremarkable, forgettable, exactly the kind of person who could move through the city without drawing attention. But the women knew. The women always knew. Giulia Tofana was not merely a poisoner, she was a businesswoman. The trade in Aqua Tofana was profitable, far more profitable than selling cosmetics or herbal remedies to ease headaches or menstrual cramps. A single vial of the poison, no larger than a perfume bottle, could be sold for a price that would feed a family for a month, and the demand was constant, inexhaustible, because the conditions that drove women to seek it never changed. The beatings did not stop. The law did not reform. The church did not soften its doctrine. And so the women kept coming year after year, desperate and determined, willing to pay whatever Giulia asked, because the alternative, continuing to live under the fist of a violent husband, was worse than any risk. Giulia understood this. She had lived it. She had watched her mother endure it, and then watched her mother choose the most dangerous path of all, not escape, but resistance. And though that resistance had ended in flames, it had also taught Giulia a lesson. The poison was not just a weapon. It was a currency, a form of power in a world that offered women almost none. And she wielded it carefully. The network expanded under Giulia's management in ways it never had before. She recruited other women, widows mostly, but also unmarried women, women whose reputations were already compromised, who had nothing left to lose. She taught them how to make the poison, how to dilute it properly, how to bottle it in vials disguised as cosmetics or devotional oils. She taught them the language of the trade, the euphemisms and coded phrases that kept transactions secret even when conducted in semi-public spaces. Manna di San Nicola, they called it in Rome. Manna of St. Nicholas. It was sold in small glass bottles with the image of the saint painted on the label, as though it were holy water brought back from a pilgrimage, something to bless a home or protect against evil. Women bought it openly in the markets, tucked it into their baskets alongside bread and candles, carried it home without fear of suspicion. Who would question a bottle of holy water? Who would suspect a woman of piety, kneeling in church with a rosary in her hands, of carrying poison in her pocket? The disguise was perfect, and it allowed the trade to flourish in plain sight, protected by the very institutions that would have condemned it. Giulia's success was not built on volume, but on discretion. She did not sell to everyone who asked. She interviewed each woman who came to her, listening carefully to her story, assessing whether the woman could be trusted, whether she had the nerve to follow through, whether she understood the risks. Some women Giulia turned away, women who seemed too frightened, too conflicted, too likely to confess under pressure or to break down and reveal the source of the poison. Women who wanted the poison not for themselves, but to give to someone else, to settle a feud or claim an inheritance they had no moral right to. Giulia refused those women. She was not a hired killer. She was not in the business of murder for profit in the crude sense. She saw herself, rightly or wrongly, as providing a service, a means of escape for women who had no other options. The distinction mattered to her, even if the law would not have recognized it. And the women she did help, she helped completely. She advised them on dosage, on timing, on how to avoid suspicion. She warned them to mourn convincingly, to show the appropriate grief, to play the role of the devoted wife, even as they were ending their husbands' lives. She told them to call for physicians, to seem concerned, to do everything a loving spouse would do. The performance, she understood, was as important as the poison itself. And most of the women listened. Most of them succeeded. Most of them walked away free, widowed and legally entitled to whatever property their husbands had left behind, their secret buried with the dead. But there were failures. There always are. Some women dosed too quickly, too obviously. A husband who fell violently ill immediately after a meal raised questions. Physicians, though limited in their knowledge, were not idiots. A pattern of sudden illness following specific meals prepared by a specific person could be noticed, could be remarked upon, could lead to whispers and accusations. Some women confessed, under the weight of guilt, or fear, or the relentless pressure of a confessor who sensed something wrong they broke. They admitted what they had done. They named Giulia Tofana, but even then nothing happened, or nothing immediate. The Inquisition was a vast bureaucracy, slow-moving and overburdened with cases of heresy, witchcraft, blasphemy, and moral corruption. A single accusation, especially one made by a woman of a low social standing, did not automatically trigger an investigation. There were protocols, procedures, a hierarchy of sins and crimes that determined which cases received attention and which were filed away and forgotten. And Giulia was careful. She moved frequently, changing addresses, changing names sometimes, always staying one step ahead of any inquiry that might be forming. She cultivated relationships with priests, making generous donations, attending confession regularly, performing the rituals of piety that kept her above suspicion. She was a widow, a woman of modest means, devout and unremarkable. No one looked too closely. No one wanted to. For 30 years, Giulia Tofana operated in the shadows of Rome, Naples, and the smaller cities of southern Italy. 30 years of vials sold, of husbands poisoned, of women freed. The estimates vary wildly, distorted by myth and the unreliable testimony of those who were later arrested and tortured into confessions. Some sources claim she was responsible for the deaths of 600 men. Others say 400. Still others suggest the number was much lower, perhaps only a few dozen, and that the higher figures were the invention of prosecutors eager to inflate the crime, to make the trial more sensational, to justify the punishment. The truth is impossible to know. What is certain is that by the middle of the 17th century, Giulia Tofana had become a legend in her own time, a name whispered in kitchens and market stalls, a figure both feared and admired depending on who was speaking. To the women she helped, she was a saviour, a saint of a different kind, one who answered prayers the church would not. To the authorities, she was a monster, a symbol of female disobedience taken to its most lethal extreme. And to history, she became something else, a ghost, a story. A woman whose existence was undeniable, but whose life remained almost entirely unknown, shaped more by what others said about her than by anything she said herself. She left no letters, no diary, no confession written in her own hand. She left only the poison and the bodies. And the question, still unanswered after 4 centuries, how many women trapped in marriages that were slowly killing them chose to kill first? Chapter 4. The Language of Suffering. To understand why Aqua Tofana spread through Italy like a secret gospel, one must first understand what it meant to be a wife in the 17th century. It was not a partnership. It was not a union of equals. It was a condition of legal and spiritual submission so total, so deeply embedded in every layer of society, that even to question it was to question the order of the universe itself. The Church taught that woman was made from man's rib, created to be his helpmate, his companion, his subordinate. The law codified this into property relationships. A woman's body, her labour, her possessions, even her children, all belonged to her husband by right. And if he chose to enforce that ownership with violence, there was no authority on earth that would stop him. This was not cruelty in the eyes of the law. It was correction, discipline, a husband's duty even to govern his household as God governed creation, with firmness, with authority, with the occasional application of force when mercy failed. The priest said so from the pulpit, the legal scholars wrote it into statute, the physicians explained it in terms of humoral theory and the natural weakness of the female body, which required male guidance to function properly, and the women, most of them, most of the time, endured. The violence was everywhere. So common it barely registered as remarkable. A man who struck his wife in public might be scolded, might be told to show more restraint, but he would not be arrested. If the woman went to the authorities, and few did, she might be told to be more obedient, to avoid provoking her husband, to pray for patience. If her injuries were severe enough to require medical attention, the physician might note them in his records, but unless the woman was maimed or killed, there was no legal remedy, no protection, no escape. If she fled to her family, they might take her in for a time. But the pressure would be enormous, from the church, from the community, from the economic reality that a married woman had no independent means of support. Her family might have already spent her dowry. They might have other daughters to marry off, other alliances to maintain, and so, more often than not, she would be sent back. For the sake of her children, for the sake of her reputation, for the sake of peace. And when she returned, the beatings would resume, sometimes worse than before, because flight was disobedience and disobedience required punishment. The stories were endless, preserved in fragments across court records, church archives, and the private letters of those who bore witness. There was the merchant's wife in Naples whose husband broke her arm with a fireplace poker during an argument over household expenses. She could not use her hand properly afterward. It healed crooked, the bones fused at an angle. She continued to cook his meals, to mend his clothes, to share his bed. There was the baker's wife in Rome who lost 3 teeth when her husband struck her across the face with the back of his hand, frustrated that supper was not ready when he returned from the tavern. She bled for an hour. No physician was called. The neighbours heard her cries but did not intervene. It was not their business. It was a private matter. There was the noblewoman in Florence who bore 12 children in 14 years, each pregnancy a risk, each birth a crucible of pain and potential death. Her body was wrecked by it. Prolapsed organs, chronic infections, a weakness in her pelvis that made walking agony. Her husband, displeased with her inability to manage the household as she once had, began taking his frustrations out on her body in other ways. She wrote to her brother, begging for refuge. He wrote back advising patience and prayer. There was the widow, though she was not yet a widow when her story began, who was locked in a cellar for 3 days without food, because she had questioned her husband's decision to sell a piece of land that had been part of her dowry. When he finally released her, she was barely conscious. She recovered. She said nothing, and then, 6 months later, he died of a wasting illness that the physicians could not explain. No one suspected her. Why would they? She had been a good wife, obedient, suffering in silence as women should. The law offered no recourse. In theory, a woman could petition for a separation, not a divorce, which did not exist, but a legal separation that would allow her to live apart from her husband. But the grounds for such a separation were narrow and difficult to prove. She had to demonstrate that her life was in immediate, ongoing danger, that her husband's violence was extreme beyond the ordinary, not merely beatings but attempted murder, and even then the separation, if granted, did not dissolve the marriage. She was still his wife. She could not remarry, she could not reclaim her dowry, and if her husband decided he wanted her back, the law was on his side. The church courts, which handled marital disputes, were only slightly more sympathetic. A woman could seek the intercession of a priest, who might counsel her husband toward gentler behaviour, but this depended entirely on the temperament of the individual priest. Some were genuinely compassionate. Others believed that a woman complaining about her husband was evidence of pride, of a rebellious spirit that needed to be broken, not coddled. And if the husband was wealthy, if he was well connected, if he made generous donations to the parish, then the priest's sympathies were likely to lie with him regardless of what the woman said. There were convents, it was true. Women could take vows, could enter religious life, could find a kind of safety behind convent walls. But this required a dowry, sometimes as much as a marriage dowry, and most families could not or would not pay twice. A woman who fled her marriage to enter a convent was seen as abandoning her duty, disgracing her family, and wasting resources that could have been used to secure another alliance. And not all convents were places of refuge. Some were little more than prisons for inconvenient women. The unmarriageable daughters of noble families, the widows with no male relatives to take them in, the wives whose husbands wanted them gone but could not legally dispose of them. Life in such convents was often harsh, regimented, cold. The nuns were isolated, cut off from the world, subject to the authority of abbesses who could be as tyrannical as any husband. So even the convent, for most women, was not an escape. It was simply a different cage. And yet, despite all this, the narrative that prevailed, the narrative preached from pulpits and written into legal texts and whispered by mothers to daughters, was that marriage was a woman's highest calling, her natural destiny, the role for which God had created her. To be unmarried was to be suspect. A woman without a husband or a convent was dangerous, unmoored, a potential source of chaos. She might fall into prostitution. She might become a burden on her family. She might use her freedom in ways that threatened the social order. So girls were married young, often by arrangement to men they barely knew. Their consent, if it was sought at all, was largely a formality. The marriage was a contract between families, not individuals. The girl's feelings, her desires, her dreams, these were irrelevant. She was a resource to be managed, an alliance to be secured, a womb to be filled with legitimate heirs. And once married, she belonged to her husband in a way that was absolute. The physical violence was only one aspect of it. There was also the sexual violence, though it was not called that. A husband's right to his wife's body was assumed, unquestioned, backed by both civil and canon law. A wife could not refuse. To do so was grounds for punishment, for accusation of disobedience, for public shaming. Marital rape, as a concept, did not exist. The very phrase would have been nonsensical to most people in the 17th century. How could a man rape his own wife? She was his, her body was his. To use it as he saw fit was simply the exercise of his legal rights. And if she became pregnant, as most wives did, repeatedly, relentlessly, the pregnancy itself was another kind of danger. Childbirth was the leading cause of death for women of childbearing age. 1 in 5 pregnancies ended in the mother's death. Infection, hemorrhage, obstructed labour, exhaustion. These were the ordinary risks of bringing a child into the world, and if she survived, there would be another pregnancy, and another, because a husband's right to his wife's body included the right to demand children, regardless of the toll it took on her health. Physicians warned against too many pregnancies too close together. They documented the physical destruction that repeated childbirth caused: prolapse, fistulas, chronic pain, permanent disability. But these warnings were rarely heeded. A wife's duty was to bear children. Her health was secondary to the continuation of the family line. Some women, it must be said, had kind husbands, men who did not beat them, who did not force themselves upon them, who treated them with a measure of respect and affection. But even these women were not free. Even in the gentlest marriages, the wife had no legal autonomy. She could not own property. She could not sign contracts. She could not testify in court without her husband's permission. She could not make decisions about her own children, their education, their marriages, their futures, without his approval. And if he died, she might find herself under the guardianship of his male relatives, or her own, with no more freedom than she had as a wife. The kindness of individual men did not change the structure. The cage was still a cage, even if the bars were gilded. And so, when Giulia Tofana offered an alternative, a way out that did not require permission, that did not depend on the mercy of men or the intercession of the church, that placed the power of life and death back into the hands of the women who had been told they had no power at all, the women listened. They came in secret. They paid what they could. They took the small glass vials and hid them away, sometimes for years, until the moment when endurance was no longer possible, when the weight of suffering finally exceeded the fear of damnation. And then, with hands that had kneaded bread and bathed children and endured countless violations, they measured out 4 drops into a cup of wine, 4 drops, so small, so quiet, and history turned. Chapter 5. The Network. The trade in Aqua Tofana did not spread through advertisements or public announcements or any mechanism that left a written record. It spread the way secrets always spread among women, through the channels that existed beneath the surface of official life, through the networks of kinship and labour and shared suffering that connected servants to mistresses, laundresses to merchants' wives, midwives to noblewomen labouring in darkened chambers. It spread in whispers exchanged over wash basins and in market stalls, in the brief moments when women's work brought them together and the men were elsewhere. occupied with the business of governance and commerce and war. It spread because women talked to each other, because they always had, because the sharing of knowledge about survival was older than any law or church doctrine that sought to contain it. A servant girl might notice the bruises on her mistress's arms, the way she flinched when her husband's voice rose, the way she moved carefully, protecting ribs that had been cracked and poorly healed. The servant might say nothing directly, but she might mention, casually, that she had heard of a woman in another household who had found relief from a difficult situation. She might describe, in vague terms, a shop near a certain church, or a widow who lived in a particular quarter, who sold remedies for women's troubles. She would not say more than that. She did not need to. The mistress would understand, or she would not. And if she understood, she would find her way to the source without further guidance. Or a midwife, attending a birth, might notice the way a woman's body bore the marks of violence, the old scars layered beneath new ones, the evidence of years of brutality that no amount of prayer or patience had softened. After the birth, when the husband had left the room and the new mother lay exhausted, the midwife might lean close and speak quietly about options, about alternatives, about a remedy that required no permission from priest or physician or male relative. She might produce a small bottle from her bag, or she might simply provide a name, an address, a coded phrase that would open certain doors. The network grew organically, protected by its own invisibility. There were no membership lists, no written instructions, no formal organization that could be infiltrated or destroyed. Each woman knew only what she needed to know, where to obtain the poison, how much to pay, how to use it. She did not know who else was using it, or how many, or where they lived. She did not need to know. The isolation was part of the protection. If one woman was caught, she could not betray a network she had never fully seen. Giulia Tofana understood this instinctively. She had learned from her mother's execution that to operate openly was to invite destruction, that the authorities would tolerate many things but not a direct challenge to their power over life and death. So she remained hidden, even as her product spread through Rome and Naples and beyond. She used intermediaries, women who distributed the poison on her behalf, who never mentioned her name, who referred to her only obliquely if they referred to her at all. She changed locations frequently, never staying in one place long enough for patterns to form, for suspicions to coalesce into accusations. She cultivated an appearance of piety and poverty, the kind of woman who attracted no attention because there was nothing about her that seemed worthy of notice, and she diversified her product line. The poison was not sold only as poison. It was sold as cosmetic, as medicine, as devotional oil. The bottles that contained Aqua Tofana were labelled with the image of St. Nicholas, or the Virgin Mary, or simply left unmarked, indistinguishable from the countless other vials and jars that filled the apothecaries and market stalls of Italian cities. A woman purchasing such a bottle might be buying poison, or she might be buying rose water, or holy water brought back from a pilgrimage, or a tonic for headaches. The transaction was ambiguous by design, and the ambiguity was its own form of protection. If the authorities questioned a woman found in possession of a suspicious bottle, she could claim ignorance. She could say she thought it was perfume or medicine or a charm against evil. She could say she'd been deceived, that she had purchased it in good faith from a vendor whose name she could not remember. The deniability was built into the transaction itself. The poison moved through Italy disguised as ordinary commerce, as the unremarkable exchange of goods between women, as the kind of transaction that happened 1,000 times a day in every city and town and village, and attracted no scrutiny because there was nothing obviously illegal about it. A bottle of scented water, a jar of face cream, a vial of oil blessed by a priest. These were normal things, innocent things, and only the women who knew what to look for, who understood the codes and the silent signals, recognized them for what they truly were. The network reached into every level of society. Servants and noblewomen, merchants' wives and prostitutes, widows and married women still living under their husbands' roofs. The poison did not discriminate. It served whoever could pay for it, whoever had the courage to use it, whoever had reached the point where the risk of damnation seemed preferable to another day of suffering. There were women of the aristocracy who used it, whose names would later appear in trial records, whose positions of privilege had not protected them from the brutality of their marriages. There were women so poor that they saved for months to afford a single vial, skimming coppers from the household accounts, selling their own meagre possessions, doing whatever was necessary to obtain the means of their deliverance. And there were women in between, the vast middle range of Italian society, the shopkeepers' wives and artisans' daughters, and minor officials' spouses, women whose lives were neither destitute nor comfortable, whose suffering was neither extraordinary nor negligible, who simply wanted the pain to stop. The poison gave them agency in a world that offered them almost none. It gave them the power to make a decision about their own lives, to take an action that was theirs alone, that did not require the approval or permission of any man. It was an act of autonomy so radical that it could only be conducted in absolute secrecy, because to admit it was to admit that women were capable of violence, of calculation, of the kind of cold-blooded decision-making that the law and the church insisted belonged only to men. Women were supposed to be passive, emotional, incapable of sustained deception. The existence of Aqua Tofana and the network that distributed it contradicted this assumption so thoroughly that even when the authorities began to suspect what was happening, they struggled to believe it. How could so many women, acting independently, without any formal organisation or leadership, carry out such a systematic campaign of murder? It seemed impossible, and yet the bodies kept accumulating. The symptoms were too consistent to be coincidental. Physicians in Rome began to notice a pattern. Men who had been healthy or relatively healthy, who suddenly fell ill with gastrointestinal complaints that progressed to weakness, trembling, delirium, and death. Men whose widows showed little grief, who remarried quickly, who seemed almost relieved by their husband's passing. Men whose deaths occurred in clusters, concentrated in certain neighbourhoods, certain parishes, certain social circles. The physicians discussed these cases among themselves, comparing notes, searching for a common cause. They considered plague, though the symptoms did not match. They considered food poisoning, though the victims did not all eat at the same establishments. They considered the possibility of a contagion, some new disease that had not yet been identified. But the pattern of illness did not spread the way contagion spread. It seemed to strike randomly, affecting some households but not others, some men but not their neighbours, or colleagues or relatives. It was a physician named Girolamo Spara who first articulated the suspicion that would eventually unravel the network. He had been called to attend a man dying of what appeared to be a wasting illness, a wealthy merchant whose wife had summoned him too late, when the patient was already beyond saving. Spara noted the symptoms in his journal, the progressive weakness, the tremors, the confusion that bordered on madness in the final hours. He noted also the wife's behaviour, which struck him as peculiar. She was not hysterical with grief, as many wives were. She was calm, composed, almost businesslike in her interactions with him. She asked practical questions about the disposal of the body, about the timing of the funeral, about her legal rights as a widow. She did not weep. She did not pray. She simply waited for her husband to die. And when he finally did, she thanked Spara for his attendance and paid him promptly. Spara left the house troubled. He could not articulate why exactly, but something about the death felt wrong. He began to review his records, looking for similar cases, and found more than he expected. Over the previous 5 years, he had attended the deaths of at least a dozen men who had died of similar symptoms, and in nearly every case, the widow had behaved with the same strange composure. He discussed this with his colleagues. Some dismissed his concerns, attributing the pattern to coincidence or to his own overwrought imagination. But others admitted they had noticed the same thing. Too many widows, too many unexplained deaths, too much consistency in the symptoms. The rumours began slowly, circulating first among the physicians and then spreading outward into the broader community. There was talk of a poison, a substance that left no taste or smell, that killed slowly and could not be detected. There was talk of a network of women, of a secret trade in death that operated beneath the surface of respectable society. The talk was vague at first, more speculation than accusation, but it gained momentum as more people began to pay attention, as more deaths were re-examined in light of this new suspicion. The authorities were reluctant to act. The accusations were too extraordinary, too difficult to prove, and the social implications were deeply uncomfortable. To admit that wives were poisoning their husbands in significant numbers was to admit that something was fundamentally wrong with the institution of marriage itself. that the violence and suffering that women endured was driving them to desperate measures. It was easier to dismiss the rumours, to insist that the deaths were natural, that the pattern was coincidental, that women were not capable of such calculated cruelty. But the rumours persisted, and eventually the Church could no longer ignore them. The Inquisition, which had jurisdiction over crimes that involved moral corruption and heresy, began to make inquiries. They were subtle at first, interviewing physicians, questioning widows whose husbands had died under suspicious circumstances, searching for evidence that could support the allegations. They found little. The women were careful. They maintained their stories. They produced physicians' reports that attributed their husbands' deaths to natural causes. They performed their grief convincingly, dressed in black, attended masses for the dead, prayed publicly for their husbands' souls. There was nothing to contradict their accounts, nothing that could be used as evidence in a court of law. And then one of them broke. A woman whose name has not survived in the records, a woman who had been arrested on unrelated charges, who was facing torture and desperate to avoid it, offered information in exchange for leniency. She confessed that she had poisoned her husband. She described how she had obtained the poison, from whom, and how it was to be used. She named others, women in her neighbourhood who had done the same, and she named Giulia Tofana. The confession opened a door that could not be closed. The Inquisition moved quickly once they had a starting point. They arrested the women whose names had been given, and under interrogation some of them confessed as well. They provided more names, more details about the network, more information about how the poison was obtained and distributed. The arrests spread like a contagion of their own, moving through the parishes of Rome and Naples, targeting women whose husbands had died suspiciously, women who had been seen in the company of known distributors, women whose behaviour had attracted attention for any reason. The Inquisition did not require strong evidence to arrest someone. Suspicion was enough, rumour was enough, and once a woman was arrested, the threat of torture was usually sufficient to extract a confession. Whether true or false, the network, which had operated in secrecy for decades, was suddenly exposed. The scale of it shocked even the hardened inquisitors. Hundreds of women, possibly more, had been involved in some capacity. Hundreds of men had died. The numbers were staggering, almost incomprehensible. The Church proclaimed it evidence of demonic influence, of a corruption so deep and widespread that only the most severe measures could root it out. The civil authorities, alarmed by the threat to public order, cooperated fully with the investigation. Arrests were made, trials were convened, sentences were passed, and at the centre of it all, the name that appeared in every confession, in every testimony, in every denunciation was Giulia Tofana. She was the source. She was the architect. She was the woman who had turned murder into a cottage industry, who had weaponized the desperation of suffering wives and turned it into profit and power. The authorities wanted her more than anyone else. She was the symbol of everything the network represented, the embodiment of female disobedience taken to its most lethal extreme. And she had evaded capture for 30 years, moving through the cities of Italy like a ghost, always one step ahead of the authorities, always protected by the silence of the women she served. But now, with the network collapsing and the confessions piling up, and the Inquisition offering clemency to those who cooperated, that silence was breaking. Women who had once protected Giulia, who had once considered her a saviour, were now giving up her location, her aliases, her methods. The authorities closed in. They searched the neighbourhoods where she was rumoured to live. They questioned everyone who might have had contact with her. They offered rewards for information leading to her arrest. And slowly, methodically, they narrowed the search until there was nowhere left for her to run. Chapter 6. 600 Shadows. The number appeared first in the trial records, spoken by a prosecutor whose voice carried the weight of moral certainty and political necessity. 600 men, 600 husbands dead by poison, their deaths orchestrated by a single woman and her network of accomplices. The figure was repeated in the official documents, in the letters sent between church authorities, in the reports compiled for the Pope himself. 600. It became the central fact of the case, the evidence of a conspiracy so vast and so successful that it threatened the very foundations of Christian marriage and masculine authority. 600 corpses, 600 widows, 600 acts of murder disguised as natural death. But numbers are strange things in history. They carry the appearance of precision while obscuring the messiness of truth. Where did the number come from? How was it calculated? The trial records do not explain. They simply assert it as fact, and that assertion was repeated so many times, in so many contexts, that it took on the weight of established truth. But the actual evidence was far more ambiguous. The confessions extracted under torture were unreliable, as confessions extracted under torture always are. Women confessed to crimes they had not committed, named names of people they had never met, provided details that could not be verified, all in the desperate hope that their suffering would end if they told their interrogators what they wanted to hear. The physicians' records were incomplete, fragmentary, often contradictory. Men died of many causes in 17th century Italy, and distinguishing between death by poison and death by disease or accident or simple old age was not a science but a guess, an interpretation shaped as much by suspicion and social anxiety as by medical observation. Still, even if the number was inflated, even if it was more propaganda than fact, the underlying reality was undeniable. Women had been poisoning their husbands, not all women, not even most women, but enough of them, over a long enough period that the pattern was real and the threat was real, and the authorities had reason to be alarmed. The question was not whether the poisonings had occurred, but how many, over what span of time, and whether they represented a coordinated conspiracy or simply the independent actions of desperate individuals who happened to use the same method. The prosecutors favoured the conspiracy narrative because it justified the severity of their response, and because it fit neatly into existing anxieties about female power and moral corruption. The idea that women could act independently, without organisation or leadership, to systematically murder their husbands was too disturbing to contemplate. It suggested a level of agency and calculation that contradicted everything the culture believed about women. So the conspiracy narrative was imposed, whether it fit the facts or not, and Giulia Tofana was cast as the mastermind, the criminal genius who had turned ordinary wives into killers. The deaths themselves, when examined individually, told a more complicated story. There were cases where the evidence was strong, where the symptoms matched arsenic poisoning so closely that even without modern toxicology, the conclusion seemed inescapable. There were men who had complained of being poisoned before they died, who had accused their wives directly, whose suspicions had been dismissed by physicians who saw no physical evidence of foul play. There were widows who had remarried with suspicious haste, who had shown no grief, who had profited substantially from their husbands' deaths. These cases, while disturbing, were also relatively rare. More common were the ambiguous cases, the deaths that could have been poison or could have been disease, where the symptoms overlapped with a dozen other conditions and the only real evidence was circumstantial or based on confession obtained under duress. One such case involved a woman named Caterina, a baker's wife in Rome whose husband had died after a prolonged illness that began with stomach pains and ended with total physical collapse. The physician who attended him diagnosed an imbalance of the humours and prescribed bloodletting and herbal remedies that did nothing to slow the progression of the disease. The husband lingered for 2 months, growing weaker each day, until finally he died in his sleep. Caterina mourned appropriately, held a modest funeral, and returned to running the bakery with the help of her eldest son. Nothing about the death seemed unusual until 3 years later, when Caterina was arrested as part of the broader investigation into the poison network. Under interrogation, she confessed that she had obtained Aqua Tofana from a woman she knew only as the widow near the Tiber, and had administered it to her husband over the course of several weeks. She described the dosage, the method, the gradual decline of his health. Her confession was detailed, consistent, and seemingly credible. But there were reasons to doubt it. Caterina had been held in prison for 4 days before she confessed, during which time she had been threatened with torture. She was illiterate, frightened, and had no legal representation. The details of her confession matched almost exactly the details provided by other women who had confessed earlier, suggesting that she might have been coached or that her interrogators had supplied the narrative and she had simply agreed to it. And most tellingly, when asked to identify the woman who had sold her the poison, she could not. She gave a vague description that could have fit dozens of women in Rome, and could not provide an address or any other information that would allow the authorities to verify her story. The widow near the Tiber might have been real, or might have been a convenient fiction, a detail borrowed from someone else's confession and inserted into her own. The case of Caterina was typical. Many of the women arrested during the investigation confessed to poisoning their husbands, but the reliability of these confessions was questionable. Some women confessed to crimes that could not possibly have been committed, claiming to have purchased poison from Giulia Tofana during years when Giulia was known to be living in a different city. Others confessed to using methods that were inconsistent with the known properties of Aqua Tofana, describing effects that were too rapid or too violent or simply not characteristic of arsenic poisoning. And still others confessed and then recanted, claiming they had been coerced or had misunderstood the questions or had confessed to protect someone else. The investigators dismissed these recantations as attempts to escape justice, but they raised troubling questions about the integrity of the entire proceeding. The problem of proof was compounded by the absence of physical evidence. Bodies that had been buried months or years earlier could not be exhumed and examined with any scientific rigour. The medical knowledge of the time was insufficient to detect poison in tissue that had already begun to decompose, and even if poison could be detected, there was no way to determine when it had been administered or by whom. The prosecutors relied almost entirely on confessions and on the testimony of witnesses who claimed to have seen suspicious behaviour, testimony that was often vague, contradictory, or motivated by personal grudges. In one case, a woman was accused of poisoning her husband based solely on the testimony of a neighbour who claimed to have seen her acting strangely near the well from which the household drew its water. The neighbour could not say what exactly was strange about the behaviour, only that it had seemed suspicious at the time. This was deemed sufficient grounds for arrest. The trials themselves were conducted with a speed that suggested the outcome had been predetermined. The accused women were not provided with legal counsel. They were not allowed to call witnesses in their own defence. They were not permitted to cross-examine the witnesses who testified against them. The proceedings were conducted in Latin, a language most of the women did not understand, and the transcripts were read to them through interpreters whose translations may or may not have been accurate. The judges were ecclesiastical authorities whose primary concern was not justice in any modern sense, but the restoration of moral order and the demonstration of the Church's power to punish sin. Acquittal was rare. Most women were convicted based on their own confessions, regardless of how those confessions had been obtained, and sentenced according to the severity of their crimes as the judges understood them. The sentences varied. Some women were executed, strangled, and then burned as Giulia's mother had been, their deaths made public spectacles intended to deter others from similar crimes. Some were sentenced to life imprisonment in convents that functioned as prisons, where they would spend their remaining years in isolation and penance. Some were sentenced to public flogging, to branding, to exile from the cities where they had lived. A few, those who had cooperated fully with the investigation and provided information that led to additional arrests, were shown clemency and released after serving brief sentences or paying fines. The disparity in sentencing reflected not the relative guilt of the accused, but the utility they represented to the prosecution and the degree to which their punishment could serve as a useful example. And yet, for all the trials and all the confessions and all the executions, the actual scale of the poisonings remained uncertain. 600 was a number designed to shock, to justify the severity of the response, to transform what might have been individual acts of desperation into evidence of a vast conspiracy. But the evidence did not support such a figure. The trial records document perhaps a few dozen confirmed cases where the evidence was strong enough to convince even sceptical observers. Beyond that, the numbers dissolve into rumour and speculation, and the unreliable testimony of women who had been tortured or threatened into confession. Modern historians who have examined the case estimate that the true number of deaths attributable to Aqua Tofana was probably in the dozens, perhaps as high as 100, but almost certainly not 600. The higher figure was propaganda, a tool used by the Church and the state to amplify the threat and to justify the extraordinary measures taken to suppress it. But even if the number was smaller, even if it was only 50 deaths or 70 or 100, the implications were no less disturbing. Each death represented a woman who had reached the point where murder seemed preferable to continued suffering, who had taken an action that required extraordinary courage and calculation, who had risked her immortal soul and her earthly life to free herself from a situation the law and the Church insisted she must endure. The scale of the network whether it involved hundreds of women or only dozens, revealed a level of discontent with the institution of marriage that the authorities found deeply threatening. It suggested that the violence and oppression that defined women's lives were not isolated incidents, but systemic problems that drove even otherwise pious and obedient women to desperate measures. The Church responded by intensifying its rhetoric about female obedience and the sanctity of marriage. Sermons were preached throughout Italy, warning of the dangers of female independence, of the corrupting influence of women who refused to accept their subordinate role, of the eternal damnation that awaited those who raised their hands against their husbands. Priests were instructed to be more vigilant in counselling married couples, to watch for signs of discontent or rebellion in their female parishioners, to report suspicious behaviour to the authorities. The confessional, which had always been a space of spiritual guidance, became also a space of surveillance, where women who expressed doubts about their marriages or who asked questions about poison or who simply seemed unhappy were subject to scrutiny and potential denunciation. The civil authorities, meanwhile, tightened the legal restrictions on women's autonomy. New laws were passed making it more difficult for widows to manage their own property, requiring them to submit to the authority of male guardians even after their husbands' deaths. The sale of certain substances, including arsenic, was more strictly regulated, though enforcement was inconsistent and the regulations were easily circumvented. More significantly, the penalties for domestic murder were made more severe, with mandatory death sentences for women convicted of killing their husbands, regardless of the circumstances that might have driven them to it. The law did not recognize extenuating circumstances. It did not acknowledge the possibility that a woman might kill in self-defense or out of desperation. It simply asserted that the murder of a husband by a wife was the worst form of treason, a crime against God and nature that could not be tolerated under any conditions. The effect of these measures was to drive the network deeper underground, not to eliminate it. Women who might have sought out Aqua Tofana now sought other methods, other sources, other means of escape. The poison itself did not disappear. It continued to circulate for decades after Giulia Tofana's arrest, sold by other women who had learned the formula, distributed through the same informal networks that had always existed. The authorities discovered this to their frustration when new cases of suspected poisoning continued to appear, when widows continued to remarry with suspicious speed, when men continued to die of unexplained illnesses that physicians could not treat. The suppression of the network had been incomplete, as all such efforts at suppression inevitably are. The underlying conditions that drove women to poison their husbands had not changed. The violence had not stopped. The law had not reformed. And so the women continued to find ways to resist, to protect themselves, to claim whatever small measure of freedom they could, even if that freedom came at the cost of a man's life and their own eternal soul. Chapter 7. The Confession. The woman who broke first was not one of the distributors or one of Giulia's known associates, but rather a customer, a woman of modest means whose husband had died 2 years earlier under circumstances that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but that now, in the atmosphere of suspicion that had settled over Rome, seemed worthy of investigation. Her name was Maria Aldobrandini, though whether that was her real name or a name assigned to her in the trial records is unclear. She lived in the Trastevere district, in a narrow house wedged between a tailor's shop and a wine merchant's storeroom, and she had been widowed at 34 after 8 years of marriage that had left her with 3 children and a collection of scars that she kept hidden beneath her sleeves and her bodice. The authorities came for her at dawn, as they came for most of the women, when the streets were still quiet and the neighbours were less likely to witness the arrest. 4 officers of the Inquisition, accompanied by a local constable who knew the neighbourhood and could identify the correct house, knocked on the door with the kind of insistent pounding that left no doubt about their purpose. Maria answered still in her nightclothes, her hair uncovered, her face showing the confusion and fear that came from being awakened suddenly and confronted with armed men. They did not explain the charges. They simply informed her that she was to come with them for questioning, and that she should dress quickly and bring nothing with her. She asked if she could arrange for someone to watch her children. They told her there was no time. The children, still asleep, would be left in the care of a neighbour who was summoned and who arrived, looking frightened and uncertain, but who took the children without asking questions because one did not question the Inquisition. Maria was taken to the Tor di Nona, the prison that served as the Inquisition's headquarters in Rome, a fortress built on the ruins of an ancient mausoleum, its walls thick enough to muffle any sound that might escape from within. She was led through corridors lit by torches, down stairs that descended into rooms that smelled of damp stone and human misery, and finally into a small cell that contained nothing but a wooden bench and a bucket. The door was locked behind her. She was not told what she was accused of. She was not told how long she would be held. She was simply left alone in the darkness to contemplate her situation and to understand, without being told, that her fate depended entirely on what she said when the interrogation began. The first interrogation took place the following day. Maria was brought into a larger room, better lit, where 3 men sat behind a table covered with documents. One was a priest, identifiable by his cassock and the crucifix that hung from his neck. The other 2 were officials of the Inquisition, their faces impassive, their manner formal and impersonal. Maria was not offered a chair. She stood before the table, her hands clasped in front of her. Her posture as humble as she could make it, because she understood instinctively that any sign of defiance or pride would work against her. The priest began by asking her name, her age, the names of her children, the date of her husband's death. Simple questions, administrative questions designed to establish the basic facts of her life. Maria answered truthfully because there was no reason not to. These were matters of public record, easily verified, and lying about them would only make her situation worse. Then the question shifted. How had her husband died? What illness had he suffered? Who had treated him? How long had he been sick? Maria described the illness as she remembered it. The stomach pains that had come and gone for weeks, the weakness that had made it difficult for him to work, the confusion that had set in near the end when he had spoken to people who were not there and had seemed not to recognize his own children. She described how she had called for a physician, how the physician had prescribed remedies that had not worked, how her husband had grown steadily worse until finally he had died in his sleep. Her voice was steady as she spoke, though her hands trembled slightly. She was telling the truth, or at least the version of the truth that she had told to everyone else, the version that matched the physician's report and the death certificate, and the story that had satisfied her neighbours and her priest at the time. The interrogators listened without interruption. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then the priest leaned forward and asked, in a voice that was almost gentle, whether she had loved her husband. The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, uncertain how to answer, because the truth was complicated and the lie seemed dangerous. She settled on saying that she had done her duty as a wife, that she had cared for her husband as God commanded, that she had prayed for his soul after his death. The priest nodded slowly, as though her answer confirmed something he already suspected. Then he asked whether her husband had ever struck her. Maria's breath caught. She did not answer immediately. The silence stretched out, filling the room, until finally she said in a voice barely above a whisper that her husband had sometimes been angry, that all husbands were sometimes angry, that it was not her place to judge him. The priest nodded again. He did not press further. Instead, he asked whether she had ever wished her husband dead. It was the question she'd been dreading, though she had not known until he asked it that she was dreading it. She said no. She said it quickly, firmly, with as much conviction as she could muster. The interrogators exchanged glances. One of them, the official on the left, made a note in the ledger that lay open before him. Then the priest asked whether she knew a woman named Giulia Tofana. Maria said she did not. The priest asked whether she had ever purchased anything from a woman who sold cosmetics or medicines or oils in the neighbourhood near the Tiber. Maria said she had not. The priest asked whether she knew what Aqua Tofana was. Maria hesitated again, and in that hesitation, the interrogators saw the confirmation they needed. She did know. She had heard of it, at least, even if she claimed never to have used it. The priest's expression did not change, but his voice took on a harder edge. He informed Maria that other women had confessed to using poison to kill their husbands, and that those women had named her as someone who had done the same. He told her that lying to the Inquisition was a mortal sin that would damn her soul to hell, and that the only way to save herself, both in this life and the next, was to confess the truth. Maria insisted she was telling the truth. She insisted she had done nothing wrong. She insisted that whoever had named her was mistaken, or lying, or trying to save themselves by implicating innocent people. The interrogators were unmoved. They had heard these denials before from dozens of other women, and they knew from experience that the denials would eventually give way to confession once the woman understood that there was no other path forward. They sent Maria back to her cell with instructions to think carefully about her soul, and to consider whether her pride was worth an eternity of suffering. She was held for 3 more days without further interrogation, 3 days in which she had nothing to do but sit in the darkness and contemplate her situation, and listen to the sounds that filtered through the walls, the cries of other prisoners, the footsteps of guards, the distant echo of doors opening and closing. She was given bread and water once a day, barely enough to sustain her, and she was not allowed to see her children or to send messages to anyone outside the prison. The isolation was deliberate, designed to break her will, to make her understand that she was alone, that no one was coming to help her, that her only hope lay in cooperation. When the interrogation resumed, the questions were more specific. The interrogators had evidently been investigating her husband's death, because they now asked about details that Maria had not mentioned in her first testimony, about purchases she had made in the weeks before her husband fell ill, about conversations she had had with other women in the neighbourhood, about a visit she had made to a shop near a certain church. Maria denied everything, but her denials were less confident now, her voice less steady. She could see where the questions were leading, could see the trap being constructed around her, could see that the interrogators already believed she was guilty and were simply waiting for her to confirm it. The priest reminded her again of the consequences of lying, of the torments that awaited unrepentant sinners, and then he made an offer. If she confessed voluntarily, if she provided details about how she had obtained the poison and who had sold it to her, the Inquisition would show mercy. Her life would be spared. She would be able to return to her children, though she would face other penalties, perhaps imprisonment for a time or public penance. But she would not be executed. The offer was conditional, of course, on the confession being complete and truthful, and leading to the arrest of others who were involved in the network. Maria broke on the 4th day. She confessed to everything they asked her to confess to and more besides, providing details that matched the narratives already established by other confessions, describing how she had purchased the poison from a woman whose face she could no longer remember, but whose location she could describe, explaining how she had administered it to her husband over the course of several weeks, adding it to his soup and his wine in small amounts that would not be detected. She described his symptoms, the gradual decline of his health, the relief she had felt when he finally died. She wept as she confessed, though whether the tears were genuine or performative even she might not have known. The interrogators accepted her confession without comment, wrote it down in precise legal language, and had her mark it with an X since she could not write her name. Then they asked her for names, other women she knew who had done the same, other sources of the poison, any information that might help them dismantle the network. Maria provided names, some of them real, some of them guesses, some of them possibly invented to satisfy the interrogators' demands. She named women she had seen entering certain shops, women who had been widowed under suspicious circumstances, women whose behaviour had seemed strange or secretive. Some of these women were genuinely part of the network, others were not, but once their names appeared in the records, they became targets of investigation regardless of their actual guilt. The machinery of persecution, once set in motion, did not distinguish carefully between the guilty and the merely suspected. Maria's confession triggered a cascade of additional arrests, each arrest leading to more interrogations, more confessions, more names. The network unravelling not because the interrogators were skilled investigators, but because fear and torture and the promise of mercy extracted information that might or might not be accurate, but that served the purposes of the prosecution. And at the centre of every confession, repeated so many times that it became impossible to separate truth from repetition, was the name Giulia Tofana, the woman who had created the poison, who had distributed it, who had taught others how to use it, who was responsible for all of this suffering and sin and death. Maria did not know Giulia personally, had never met her, could not describe her except in the vaguest terms, but she knew the name because everyone knew the name, because it had become synonymous with the poison itself. The interrogators seized on this, asking Maria where Giulia could be found, what aliases she used, who protected her. Maria did not know any of this, but under pressure she provided guesses, rumours she had heard, speculation that she presented as fact because the interrogators would not accept ignorance as an answer. Some of what she said was accurate by chance. Most of it was not. But it gave the authorities something to work with, a direction to pursue, and that was enough. Maria was spared execution as promised, though the mercy she received was limited. She was sentenced to 10 years of imprisonment in a convent, where she would spend her days in prayer and labour, cut off from her children and from the world, a living example of the price of disobedience. Her property was confiscated, her children placed in the care of distant relatives who may or may not have treated them well. She disappeared into the records after her sentencing, one name among many, her individual suffering subsumed into the larger narrative of the poison trials. Whether she survived her sentence, whether she ever saw her children again, whether she regretted her confession or stood by it, there is no way to know. The records do not follow individual women beyond their sentencing. They move on to the next case, the next arrest, the next confession, the vast machinery of justice grinding forward without pause or reflection. But Maria's confession opened the door that could not be closed, and through that door the authorities moved with increasing confidence and speed, following the trail of names and rumours and accusations until finally, inevitably, they found the woman they had been seeking all along. Chapter 8. The hunt for Giulia Tofana intensified in the spring of 1659, though by then she had already been evading capture for more than 2 years. The first arrest warrants had been issued in 1657, shortly after the initial wave of confessions had established her name as the central figure in the poison network. But Giulia had disappeared before the authorities could reach her, vanishing from her known address in Rome and leaving behind only empty rooms and neighbours who claimed to know nothing about where she'd gone. She'd been warned, almost certainly, by one of the women in the network who had seen the arrests beginning and understood what was coming. Or perhaps she had simply recognised the signs herself, noticed the increased presence of Inquisition officers in her neighbourhood, heard the whispers that travelled faster than official investigations, felt the shift in the atmosphere that preceded every major crackdown. Whatever the reason, she had fled in time, and for 2 years she had stayed ahead of the authorities through a combination of careful planning and the protection of women who still considered her a saviour rather than a criminal. She moved between cities, never staying long in any one place, using different names in different locations. In Naples she was known as Giulia di Napoli, a widow who sold cosmetics. In Palermo she used her mother's maiden name and claimed to be visiting relatives. In the smaller towns scattered across Sicily and Calabria, she presented herself as a travelling merchant. A woman of modest means making her living through the sale of oils and perfumes and medicinal remedies. The authorities tracked her movements through reports that arrived weeks or months after she had already left, always one step behind, always arriving to find that the woman they were looking for had departed the previous week or the previous month. Witnesses were unhelpful, their memories conveniently vague, their descriptions contradictory. Was she tall or short? Dark-haired or greying? Young or old? The answers varied depending on who was asked, and the authorities began to suspect that some of the confusion was deliberate, that women were protecting Giulia by providing false information or by simply refusing to remember anything useful. The Inquisition responded by expanding the scope of the investigation, arresting women who were suspected of harbouring Giulia or of facilitating her flight. These arrests yielded little actionable information, but they served another purpose, demonstrating to the communities that had sheltered her that the cost of protection was high and rising. Some of the women arrested were tortured, not because the authorities believed they had committed crimes themselves, but because torture was the most efficient method of extracting information about Giulia's whereabouts. The testimony obtained through these methods was unreliable, as all testimony obtained through torture is unreliable, but it created a map of sorts, a rough outline of Giulia's movements over the previous 2 years. She had been in Naples in the summer of 1657. She had been spotted in Palermo in the autumn. There were reports of a woman matching her description in Messina in early 1658, and again in Catania several months later. The pattern suggested she was moving in a circuit through southern Italy and Sicily, staying in each location only long enough to conduct some business before moving on. The authorities began to close the net, coordinating between different regional jurisdictions, sharing information more efficiently, placing agents in the cities where Giulia was most likely to appear. They offered rewards for information leading to her capture, substantial sums that would have been life-changing for anyone willing to betray her. They issued formal proclamations declaring her an enemy of the church and the state, a threat to public order and morality, a woman whose very existence was an affront to God. And still, for months, they could not find her. Part of the difficulty lay in the sheer number of women moving through Italian cities at any given time. Widows travelling to visit relatives, merchants selling goods in the markets, servants changing employment, pilgrims making their way to holy sites. Women were mobile in ways that official records did not always capture, and a woman who knew how to blend into the background, who could play the role of an ordinary traveller convincingly, could move through the country with relative freedom, as long as she did not attract attention. Giulia was skilled at not attracting attention. She dressed modestly, spoke quietly, conducted her business with a minimum of fuss. She avoided the kind of ostentatious behaviour that might make her memorable. She did not draw attention to herself in churches or markets. She did not engage in arguments or confrontations. She was, by all accounts, polite, reserved, and utterly unremarkable in her public presentation. But she made a mistake, as everyone eventually does when they're being hunted. She returned to Rome. The decision to return was risky, perhaps the most dangerous choice she could have made, because Rome was the centre of the investigation, the city where the Inquisition had its headquarters and where the hunt for her was most intense. But Rome was also where she had built her network, where she had the most contacts and the most resources, where women who owed her their freedom might be willing to hide her or help her obtain the documents she needed to leave Italy entirely. She arrived in the city in the late autumn of 1659, travelling under an assumed name and staying in a small boarding house in the Borgo district near the Vatican. She kept to herself, venturing out only to make contact with a few trusted associates, women who could provide her with money and information about possible escape routes. She was planning to leave Italy, to cross into France or Spain where the Inquisition's reach was less certain, to disappear into a foreign city where no one knew her face or her history. But someone recognised her. The identity of the person who betrayed her has never been definitively established. Some accounts claim it was a woman she had wronged in some business transaction, a former customer or distributor who felt cheated or endangered by Giulia's activities. Other accounts suggest it was a landlady or a servant who had seen the arrest warrants and recognised Giulia despite her disguise. Still others claim it was simply bad luck, that an Inquisition officer happened to see her on the street and noticed something in her bearing or her face that matched the descriptions he'd been given. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. On a cold November morning, as Giulia was leaving her boarding house to meet with one of her contacts, she was surrounded by officers of the Inquisition and placed under arrest. She did not resist. There was no point in resisting. She was outnumbered, unarmed, and exhausted from 2 years of constant flight. She allowed herself to be taken without protest, her face showing neither fear nor resignation, only a kind of calm acceptance of the inevitable. The officers searched her person and found nothing incriminating. No poison, no documents, no evidence that could be used against her in court. She had been too careful for that, had learned long ago not to carry anything that could link her to the crimes she was accused of. But they did not need physical evidence. They had the confessions of dozens of women who had named her, who had described her methods, who had provided enough detail to convict her 100 times over. She was taken to the Castel Sant'Angelo, the fortress that served as both papal residence and political prison, a structure of ancient stone and medieval additions that rose above the Tiber like a monument to power and permanence. She was led through corridors patrolled by Swiss guards, down stairs that descended into the lower levels where prisoners were held, into a cell that was larger and cleaner than the cells in the Tor di Nonna but no less secure. The door closed behind her. The lock turned, and for the first time in 30 years, Giulia Tofana had nowhere left to run. The news of her capture spread quickly through Rome and beyond. In the neighbourhoods where she had operated, women whispered the news to each other in kitchens and market stalls, their voices a mixture of sorrow and fear. Some of them wept, some of them prayed, some of them began to prepare for the possibility that they would be next, that their names were already in the records, that the authorities would come for them as they had come for so many others. The Church celebrated the capture as a great victory, a triumph of divine justice over demonic corruption. Sermons were preached thanking God for delivering the poisoner into the hands of the righteous. Proclamations were issued declaring that the cancer that had infected Christian marriage had been excised, that the network had been destroyed, that order had been restored. But the women who had known Giulia, who had relied on her, who had seen her as their only hope in a world that offered them none, knew better. The network had not been destroyed. The need for it had not disappeared. The violence that drove women to poison their husbands had not stopped. All that had changed was that one woman, one source, had been removed. Others would take her place. Others already had. The poison would continue to flow in different bottles under different names sold by different hands, but for now Giulia Tofana was in custody, and the full weight of ecclesiastical and civil authority was about to descend upon her. The interrogations began almost immediately. Giulia was brought before a panel of inquisitors who had spent months preparing for this moment, who had compiled dossiers of evidence and testimony, who had constructed a narrative of her crimes that they were determined to have her confirm. They asked her name. She gave her real name without hesitation, understanding that there was no point in maintaining a false identity now. They asked her age. She said she did not know exactly, perhaps 50, perhaps older. They asked where she was born. Palermo, she said. They asked about her mother. She confirmed that her mother had been executed for poisoning her husband. They asked if she had learned the craft from her mother. She said nothing. The inquisitors were patient. They had time. They had resources. They had the authority of the church behind them. They explained to Giulia that her situation was hopeless, that her crimes were known, that dozens of women had already confessed and named her as their supplier. They told her that resistance was futile, that her soul was already damned unless she repented, that the only question remaining was whether her death would be quick or prolonged, merciful or agonizing. Giulia listened without visible emotion. When they finished speaking, she asked if she could have water. They provided it. She drank slowly, then set the cup aside and met their eyes with a steadiness that unnerved them. She did not deny the accusations. She did not claim innocence. She simply remained silent, offering neither confession nor defense. The silence frustrated the inquisitors more than defiance would have. They needed her confession for the record, needed her to validate the narrative they had constructed, needed her words to justify the sentences they intended to impose not just on her, but on all the women who had been arrested in connection with the network. Without her confession, the case against her was built entirely on the testimony of others, and while that testimony was substantial, it lacked the authority of a direct admission from the accused. They tried persuasion. They reminded her that confession was the path to salvation, that even the worst sinner could find mercy in the eyes of God if they repented truly. They promised her that if she cooperated, if she provided a full and honest account of her activities, her death would be swift and relatively painless. They did not promise to spare her life. That was not possible. Her crimes were too serious, too widely known, too symbolically important. She would die. The only question was how. Giulia continued to say nothing. Days passed. The inquisitors varied their approach, sometimes gentle and fatherly, sometimes harsh and accusatory, sometimes simply reading to her from the confessions of other women, forcing her to hear in explicit detail the crimes she was accused of orchestrating. She listened to all of it with the same quiet composure, never interrupting, never objecting, never offering any response beyond the occasional request for water or bread. The authorities grew impatient. They discussed among themselves whether to employ torture, which was permitted under canon law when dealing with crimes of heresy or moral corruption. Some argued that torture was necessary, that Giulia's silence was a form of contempt that could not be tolerated, that breaking her would serve as an example to others who might consider similar defiance. Others argued that torture was unnecessary, that they already had enough evidence to convict her, that her silence was actually a kind of confession in itself, an admission that she could not deny the accusations because they were true. The debate continued for days while Giulia remained in her cell, alone except for the guards who brought her food and emptied her waste bucket. She was not mistreated. The conditions of her imprisonment were almost comfortable compared to what most prisoners endured. She had a bed, thin but adequate. She had blankets. She had enough food to prevent starvation. The authorities wanted her alive and presentable for trial, wanted her execution to be a spectacle of justice, rather than the disposal of a broken body. Finally, the decision was made not to torture her. The inquisitors concluded that her silence, combined with the overwhelming testimony against her, was sufficient for conviction. They would proceed to trial without her confession, and if she continued to refuse to speak, they would interpret that refusal as pride and impenitence, which would justify the harshest possible sentence. Chapter 9. The trial that never was, the trial of Giulia Tofana, was scheduled for February 1660, to be held in the Great Hall of the Apostolic Palace, a venue chosen specifically for its symbolic weight and its capacity to accommodate the crowd that was expected to attend. But the trial, in any meaningful sense, never took place. What happened instead was a proceeding that had the form of a trial, but lacked any of the substance that might distinguish justice from spectacle. There was no defense counsel. There was no opportunity for the accused to call witnesses or to challenge the testimony presented against her. There was no presumption of innocence. The outcome had been determined before the proceedings began, and the trial itself was simply a formality, a ritual performance designed to demonstrate the power of the Church and to provide a legal veneer to what was essentially an execution preceded by public condemnation. Giulia was brought into the hall in chains, flanked by guards. Her appearance carefully managed to convey both her guilt and her powerlessness. She had been dressed in a plain grey shift, the kind worn by penitents, and her hair had been cropped short, a symbolic stripping of femininity that marked her as a woman who had stepped outside the bounds of acceptable womanhood. She walked with her head up, her posture straight, showing neither defiance nor submission, simply a kind of dignity that the authorities found both impressive and infuriating. The hall was crowded with spectators, church officials, members of the papal court, representatives of the noble families whose wives had been implicated in the poison network. There were also ordinary citizens who had come to see the woman whose name had dominated conversation in Rome for months, who had become a figure of legend and terror, whose crimes had been described in such lurid detail that people could not help but be fascinated. The crowd fell silent as she entered, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and hostility, wanting to see the monster up close, wanting to understand how a woman could be responsible for so much death. The presiding judge was Cardinal Tommaso Orsini, a man known for his severity and his unwavering loyalty to papal authority. He sat at the centre of a raised platform, flanked by two other judges and a secretary whose job was to record every word spoken during the proceedings. Behind him hung a large crucifix, a visual reminder that this was not merely a civil trial, but a judgment rendered in the name of God. Cardinal Orsini began by reading the charges. They were numerous and detailed, a recitation that took nearly an hour. Giulia was accused of manufacturing and distributing poison with the intent to cause death. She was accused of corrupting the morals of Christian women by encouraging them to murder their husbands. She was accused of operating a criminal conspiracy that had resulted in the deaths of hundreds of men. She was accused of acting in defiance of church teaching, of undermining the sacrament of marriage, of serving the interests of the devil by providing women with the means to escape their divinely ordained duties. Each charge was read slowly, ceremonially, with emphasis on the most damning details. The cardinal's voice filled the hall, echoing off the stone walls, creating an atmosphere of solemnity and condemnation. Giulia stood motionless throughout, her face showing no reaction, neither fear nor remorse nor anger. She simply stood, waiting, as though she were observing something that was happening to someone else. When the charges had been read, the cardinal asked Giulia how she pleaded. It was a formality. No one expected her to plead innocent. But the question had to be asked for the record, for the sake of maintaining the appearance of proper legal procedure. Giulia did not answer. She remained silent, as she had remained silent throughout her imprisonment. The cardinal repeated the question, his voice sharper now, demanding a response. Still Giulia said nothing. The cardinal interpreted her silence as a refusal to cooperate, which under the rules of inquisitorial procedure could be treated as an admission of guilt. He declared that since the accused would not speak in her own defence, the court would proceed based on the evidence already compiled. He then called for the presentation of testimony. The testimony came not from live witnesses but from written confessions that had been collected over the previous 2 years. The secretary read them aloud, one after another, the voices of women who had confessed to using Aqua Tofana to poison their husbands. The confessions were remarkably similar, almost formulaic in their structure, which was not surprising given that many of them had been extracted under duress or threat of torture. Each woman described purchasing the poison from a woman who matched Giulia's description. Each described how she had administered it. Each expressed remorse, claimed she'd been led astray by evil counsel, and begged for mercy. The reading took hours. The crowd in the hall grew restless, but the cardinal insisted on hearing every confession in full, because the sheer volume of testimony was itself a form of proof, a demonstration that Giulia's crimes were not isolated incidents, but part of a systematic pattern. By the time the last confession had been read, the sun had moved across the sky, and the light coming through the high windows had changed from morning brightness to afternoon gold. The cardinal then called for the presentation of physical evidence. There was not much, a few bottles that had been confiscated from women arrested in connection with the network. Bottles that were said to contain Aqua Tofana, though there was no scientific method available at the time to prove their contents conclusively. The bottles were displayed on a table in front of the judges, arranged carefully to maximize their visual impact. They looked innocuous, small glass containers that could have held perfume or medicine or holy water. Their very ordinariness was somehow more disturbing than if they had looked sinister. The cardinal explained to the court that these bottles had been disguised as cosmetics or devotional items, that they bore the images of saints, that they had been sold openly in markets and shops without attracting suspicion. He described this as evidence of Giulia's cunning, her ability to corrupt even the symbols of faith by using them as covers for murder. He held up one of the bottles, turning it slowly so the crowd could see the painted image of St. Nicholas, and declared that this was blasphemy of the highest order, the perversion of the sacred in service of the profane. Then he turned his attention back to Giulia. He asked her directly whether she denied that she had manufactured and sold the poison. She didn't answer. He asked whether she denied that her actions had led to the deaths of countless men. She remained silent. He asked whether she felt any remorse for what she'd done, any sorrow for the suffering she'd caused, any fear for the state of her immortal soul. Still she said nothing. The silence stretched out, filling the hall with tension. The cardinal's face reddened with frustration and anger. He stood from his chair, leaning forward over the table, his voice rising as he demanded that she speak, that she acknowledge her crimes, that she confess and repent before it was too late. But Giulia simply looked at him with eyes that showed neither fear nor contempt, only a kind of quiet patience, as though she were waiting for him to finish so that whatever came next could begin. Finally the cardinal gave up. He declared that the accused had shown herself to be impenitent, unrepentant, hardened in sin, and therefore beyond the mercy of the Church. He announced that the court would proceed to sentencing without delay. There was no deliberation. The judges did not retire to discuss the evidence or to debate the appropriate punishment. The sentence had been prepared in advance, written out in careful legal language, ready to be read as soon as the formality of the trial had been completed. The secretary stood and read from the document, his voice flat and bureaucratic as though he were reading a property deed or a tax assessment rather than a death warrant. Giulia Tofana was found guilty of all charges. She was sentenced to death by strangulation, to be carried out publicly in the Piazza di Ponte, followed by the burning of her body and the scattering of her ashes so that no trace of her would remain. The sentence also included the confiscation of any property she owned and a formal declaration that her name was to be struck from all records, that she was to be remembered only as a cautionary tale, an example of what happened to women who defied God and nature. The sentence was read with the same ceremonial gravity that had characterized the entire proceeding. When it was finished, the secretary rolled up the document and handed it to the cardinal, who placed it on the table in front of him with an air of finality. He then pronounced the traditional formula that ended inquisitorial trials, declaring that the judgment of the court reflected the judgment of God, and that the condemned should prepare her soul for the eternity that awaited her. Giulia was given one final opportunity to speak, to make a statement, or to beg for mercy, or to offer any words that might be recorded for posterity. She considered for a moment, and then, for the first time since her arrest, she spoke. Her voice was quiet but clear, carrying across the hall despite its softness. She said only this: "I helped them escape what you would not protect them from." The hall erupted into chaos. Some people shouted in anger, others gasped in shock. The judges exchanged alarmed glances. The cardinal demanded order, pounding his fist on the table, his face purple with rage. Guards moved forward to remove Giulia from the hall before she could say anything more, before her words could undermine the narrative that had been so carefully constructed. She did not resist as they led her away, did not try to speak again. She had said what she needed to say, and it was enough. The trial concluded in confusion and disorder, the spectators arguing among themselves about what they had witnessed, about what Giulia's words meant, about whether she had shown defiance or simply stated a truth that no one wanted to acknowledge. The church officials insisted that her statement was proof of her impenitence, her refusal to accept responsibility for her crimes, her attempt to justify the unjustifiable. But others, particularly some of the women who had attended, heard something different in her words, a challenge to the entire system that had made the poison necessary in the first place. The authorities worked quickly to suppress discussion of Giulia's final statement, declaring that spreading her words constituted support for her crimes and could result in arrest and prosecution. Priests were instructed to address the matter in their sermons, to explain that Giulia's claim was a lie, that husbands had the right and duty to govern their households as they saw fit, that women who suffered were being tested by God and would be rewarded in heaven for their patience. The official narrative was reasserted, reinforced, repeated until it drowned out the uncomfortable questions that Giulia's words had raised. But the questions did not disappear entirely. They lingered in the minds of women who had heard what she said, who understood what she meant, who recognized in her defiance their own suppressed rage and despair. And though none of them dared to speak openly, though they returned to their homes and their duties in their silence, something had shifted. Some small crack had appeared in the facade of acceptance that held the entire system together. Chapter 10. The Poison's Ghost. The execution was carried out on a cold morning in early March, when the streets of Rome were still dark and the first light of dawn had not yet broken over the hills. The piazza had been prepared the night before. A scaffold had been erected in the centre of the square, high enough that the crowd would have a clear view of what was about to happen. Beside the scaffold stood a pile of wood and kindling, ready to be ignited once the body had been strangled. Guards had been posted at all the entrances to the piazza to prevent any disruption and to ensure that the execution proceeded smoothly and without incident. The crowd began gathering before sunrise, people claiming the best vantage points, pushing and shoving for position near the scaffold. Public executions were common entertainment in 17th century Rome, and this one had been anticipated for weeks, advertised in proclamations read from pulpits and posted in market squares. People came from all over the city and from surrounding towns, drawn by curiosity and by the promise of spectacle, wanting to see the woman who had become famous across Italy, whose crimes had been described in such detail that she had taken on mythic proportions. Giulia was brought to the piazza at dawn, transported in a cart that moved slowly through the narrow streets, accompanied by a procession of priests and officials. She had been dressed in the grey shift she had worn during the trial, and her hands were bound in front of her. She did not look at the crowd as the cart passed. She kept her eyes fixed on some point in the distance, her face calm and expressionless. When the cart reached the piazza, she was helped down by the guards and led to the scaffold. She climbed the steps without assistance, her movements steady despite the chains that hobbled her ankles. At the top of the platform she was positioned in the centre, beneath the iron collar that would be used for the strangulation. A priest stood beside her, offering her one final opportunity to confess and repent. She declined. She had said what she needed to say at the trial, and she had nothing to add. The executioner stepped forward, a man whose face was covered by a hood, whose identity was kept secret because even in a society that accepted execution as necessary, the actual act of killing was considered shameful work. He placed the iron collar around Giulia's neck, adjusting it carefully to ensure it would tighten properly. The crowd fell silent, watching with a mixture of anticipation and unease. The priest stepped back. The executioner tightened the collar. Giulia's body stiffened, her hands clenching into fists, but she made no sound. The process was supposed to be quick, a matter of minutes, but something went wrong. The collar did not tighten as quickly as it should have, and Giulia's death took longer than intended, her body struggling against the restraint, her face turning dark, her movements growing weaker until finally she went still. The crowd watched in silence. Some people crossed themselves, some turned away, some continued to stare, their faces showing not satisfaction, but a kind of troubled recognition that what they were witnessing was not justice but something else, something darker and more complicated. Once Giulia was dead, her body was removed from the scaffold and placed on the pile of wood. The executioner lit the kindling, and the flames rose quickly, consuming the body with a speed that suggested the wood had been treated with oil or some other accelerant. The smell of burning flesh filled the piazza, acrid and nauseating, driving some people away while others remained, compelled to witness the entire process. The body burned for hours, tended by workers who stirred the ashes and added more wood to ensure that nothing remained. By afternoon, there was nothing left but charred bone fragments, which were collected and ground into powder and scattered into the Tiber so that no relic could be preserved, no grave could become a site of pilgrimage or remembrance. Giulia Tofana was to be erased completely, removed from the earth as though she had never existed. But erasure is never complete. Memory persists even when the physical evidence has been destroyed. And Giulia's memory persisted in ways the authorities could not control. The women who had known her, who had relied on her, who had seen her as their only hope, did not forget. They told their daughters about her, in whispers and coded language, passing down the story of the woman who had helped them escape what no one else would protect them from. The story changed over time, as stories do, becoming more legend than history, but the core of it remained the same, a narrative of resistance and retribution, of women taking power in the only way available to them. The formula for Aqua Tofana did not die with Giulia. It had been distributed too widely, taught to too many women, written down in too many places for it to disappear entirely. The poison continued to circulate for decades after her death, sold under different names, in different cities, by different hands. The authorities arrested other women suspected of manufacturing or distributing it, but they could never fully suppress the trade because the demand for it never disappeared. As long as women were trapped in violent marriages with no legal recourse, as long as the church and the state refused to protect them, there would be women willing to take matters into their own hands. The legend of Giulia Tofana spread beyond Italy. Stories about her appeared in France, in Spain, in Germany, carried by travellers and merchants, and by the international networks of gossip and rumour that connected European cities. In some versions of the story, she became a kind of folk hero, a champion of abused women, a figure of defiance against patriarchal authority. In other versions, she was portrayed as a witch or a demon, a servant of Satan who corrupted good Christian women and turned them into murderers. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either extreme, but the extremes were what persisted in popular imagination. Physicians and natural philosophers began to study poison more systematically in the decades following Giulia's execution, driven in part by the recognition that women had been using it so effectively for so long without being detected. Medical texts from the late 17th and 18th centuries contain detailed descriptions of arsenic poisoning, its symptoms, its progression, its treatment. Some of these texts reference the Aqua Tofana case explicitly, using it as an example of how poison could be administered gradually to avoid detection. The case became part of the medical curriculum, a cautionary tale taught to physicians in training, a reminder that not all illness was natural and that careful observation was necessary to distinguish between disease and deliberate poisoning. The legal system also changed in response to the scandal. New laws were passed making it more difficult to purchase arsenic and other poisons without proper documentation and supervision. Apothecaries were required to keep records of their sales, noting who purchased what and for what stated purpose. Women who purchased arsenic were required to be accompanied by a male relative who would vouch for the legitimacy of the purchase. These regulations were inconsistently enforced and easily circumvented, but they represented an attempt to address the problem at its source. More significantly, some jurisdictions began to reform the laws governing domestic violence, recognizing that the poison networks were a symptom of deeper problems in the institution of marriage. These reforms were modest and came slowly, but they represented a shift in thinking, an acknowledgement that wives needed some form of legal protection against violent husbands. Separation became easier to obtain in some regions. Women were granted limited rights to control their own property. The penalties for wife-beating were increased, though enforcement remained inconsistent. These changes did not come because the authorities suddenly developed compassion for suffering women. They came because the alternative had been demonstrated to be dangerous. When women had no legal recourse, they found illegal recourse. When the law would not protect them, they protected themselves. The poison networks had shown that women were capable of organised resistance, that they could act collectively even without formal organisation, that they posed a genuine threat to the social order if pushed too far. The reforms were designed not to help women, but to prevent the emergence of another Giulia Tofana. But the reforms were too little and too late to change the fundamental dynamics of marriage and power. Women continued to suffer, men continued to abuse their authority. And in the hidden corners of Italian cities, in France, in Spain, in Germany, in every place where women were trapped and desperate, the poison continued to flow. Aqua Tofana itself became legendary. By the 18th century, its reputation had spread throughout Europe, and it appeared in literature, in popular ballads, in cautionary tales told to warn young women about the dangers of disobedience. The poison was featured in novels and plays, often as a plot device, a mysterious substance that allowed characters to commit murder without detection. The name Tofana became synonymous with poison itself, used as a generic term for any substance used to kill quietly and secretly. Some of the stories about Aqua Tofana were wildly exaggerated. It was said to be completely undetectable, which was not true. It was said to be painless, which was not true. It was said to kill instantly, which was definitely not true. But these exaggerations served a purpose, making the poison seem more dangerous and more mysterious than it actually was, reinforcing the narrative that women who used it were practitioners of dark arts rather than simply desperate people using the tools available to them. The Church continued to condemn the use of poison in the strongest possible terms, declaring it a mortal sin that damned the soul to hell with no possibility of redemption. Priests preached sermons about the Aqua Tofana case for generations, using it as an example of what happened when women defied God's plan for marriage. The sermons emphasized obedience, submission, acceptance of suffering as a path to salvation. They did not mention the violence that drove women to poison in the first place. They did not acknowledge the failures of the legal and religious systems that should have protected women but did not. They simply condemned the women who had taken matters into their own hands and warned others not to follow their example. But despite the condemnation, despite the executions, despite the reforms and the regulations and the constant surveillance, the poison did not disappear. It could not disappear as long as the conditions that made it necessary continued to exist, and those conditions persisted for centuries, changing slowly, unevenly, in ways that were often more cosmetic than substantive. By the 19th century, the Aqua Tofana case had faded from immediate memory into history. The specific details were forgotten or confused with other cases. Giulia Tofana herself became a semi-mythical figure, more symbol than person, invoked in discussions about women's crime and poison and the dangers of female autonomy. Historians began to examine the case more carefully, searching through archives for documents and testimony that could shed light on what had actually happened. Some of them concluded that the whole thing had been exaggerated, that the number of deaths had been inflated for political purposes, that Giulia Tofana might not even have been a real person, but rather a composite figure, a name attached to a network of women whose individual identities had been lost. But the documents were real, the confessions were real, the executions were real, and the poison was real. Whatever uncertainties remained about the details, the fundamental truth of the case was undeniable. For decades, women in Italy had been poisoning their husbands, using a formula that allowed them to kill without detection, operating through networks that remained hidden until they were betrayed from within. It had happened. It was part of the historical record. And it raised questions that historians and moralists and legal scholars continue to grapple with long after everyone involved had died. The questions were uncomfortable. If so many women were willing to commit murder to escape their marriages, what did that say about the institution of marriage itself? If the law and the church failed so completely to protect women from violence, could they legitimately condemn women who protected themselves? If the violence against women was systematic and socially sanctioned, could the resistance to that violence be called criminal in any meaningful sense? These questions did not have easy answers. They still do not have easy answers. They touch on fundamental issues of power and justice and the relationship between law and morality. And they remind us that history is not just a record of events, but a record of choices, of decisions made under conditions of constraint and desperation, of people trying to survive in systems that were designed to oppress them. Giulia Tofana made choices, So did the women who sought her help. So did the men who abused their wives. So did the church and the state that created and maintained the conditions that made poison seem like the only option. Everyone involved in the story made choices, and those choices had consequences that rippled outward through time. And now, centuries later, in a world that has changed in many ways, but not in all ways, the story remains. It persists in books and articles, in academic studies and popular retellings, in whispered references and half-remembered legends. It persists because it speaks to something that has not yet been fully resolved, some tension between power and resistance, between suffering and survival, between the world as it is and the world as it might be. The poison's ghost still walks, not in any literal sense, but in the way that history walks, as memory, as warning, as a story that refuses to die because the conditions that created it have not entirely disappeared. Women still suffer violence, the law still fails to protect them adequately, and while most women today do not turn to poison, they find other ways to resist, other ways to escape, other ways to claim agency in systems that seek to deny it to them. The story of Giulia Tofana and Aqua Tofana is not just a story about the past, it is a story about power, about what happens when power is abused and when resistance becomes necessary, about the lengths people will go to when they are given no other choice. It is a story that echoes through time, asking questions that each generation must answer for itself, reminding us that justice delayed is not justice at all, and that silence in the face of suffering is its own form of violence. The candles burned low in the archives where the records were kept. The pages yellowed and crumbled. The names faded, but the truth remained, preserved in ink and ash and memory, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be understood, waiting for a world that might finally hear what Giulia Tofana said at her trial and acknowledge that she was right. She helped them escape what no one else would protect them from. And history, having turned its page, moved on into the darkness. Thank you for listening to The Bedside Historian. May you rest peacefully tonight, carrying these stories with you into your dreams.